go through this. I think that's safe, because then we can use the microphones. But yeah. What happened to you?
Yeah, what happened to
Your actual presentation? Shut that. Shut it. This page we get bit unhelpful. There we have it. And roll.
All right, we might get started. So this afternoon, I am very pleased to be able to introduce you to our next plenary. And I think this follows on nicely from our morning plenary, because Natalie is going to talk about rethinking Eurasian connections in the history of medicine. So where I asked about Indigenous knowledge systems and how they're living systems now, we're going to talk about rethinking history and questioning some of the Western assumptions about the history of medicine. Natalie Köhle, is that how you, yeah, Köhle, that's sorry, is a lecturer in history and philosophy of science at Sydney University in my school. And she researches the history of Chinese medicine with comparative interest in the history of Indian and medieval Greco-Islamic medical traditions. She works on 2 book projects, one on the history of donkey hide gelatin and one on the global history of Chinese phlegm. Her recent publications include an article on Galenic medicine in the 14th century China in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine entitled The Many Colors of Excrement, Galen and the History of Chinese Phlegm, an essay on anatomical images in 13th century China, and an experimental edited volume, Fluid Matters, a cross-cultural examination of the imagination of the humoral body, which explores the use of interactive image-based storytelling for academic communication. So I hope you enjoy this talk, and please join me in welcoming Natalie to give.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. And I think we're a little bit short of time, so I'll just start right now. So most of you will have heard of or those of you who are working in the history of medicine will have heard of Joseph Needham famously saying, so Joseph Needham, who wrote Science and Civilization in China, which is this multi-volume masterpiece of thinking about why science was not did not develop in China after all, that sort of thing. And it includes 1 volume on medicine, which has only recently been published. I think it was published posthumously. And he famously said that Western and Chinese medicines are 2 rivers that have yet to converge. And by this is usually meant, and this doesn't only go back to Joseph Needham, but it's sort of a general presumption that is dominant in the field of the history of medicine, is that Western medicine is a humoral medicine, whereas Chinese medicine is based on qi and the 5 phases. And Western medicine is based on a substantive conception of matter, whereas Chinese medicine has an attributive conception of matter. And by this, I mean that in the history of Western medicine, which is roughly, I mean, this is very broad sketch. So this is Galenic medicine and all its reincarnations from the time of Galen until roughly speaking, the 18th, 19th century. So it was based on the 4 elements, and these 4 elements are different substances that are in opposition to each other and that do not merge into each other. Whereas Chinese medicine is based on the 5 phases, and although previously people like to translate this as the 5 elements and sort of likened it to the four elements of Galenic medicine, it's actually quite different in that these are different attributes of qi, which is the underlying ground of substance in Chinese medicine. So that's always the same, and it just takes on different attributes that change and evolve out of each other. So there's nothing else but qi, and everything kind of it changes from one state of being into another state of being. There's no substantive opposition per se in that kind of medical system. And then also, I'm just actually finding that I do have a watch. Okay, thanks. So, and then from that contrast between Western and Chinese medicine, also, it is often said that Western medicine is sort of a material kind of medicine, which is based on materialistic conception of the body, whereas Chinese medicine is sort of energetic, and there's different words for it, energetic, or I don't think people would say immaterial, but they like to say, if you type in energetic medicine and Chinese medicine, you'll come across loads and loads of articles on that. It's sort of, so this that part of it is because Western researchers have been looking for the theoretical foundations of Chinese medicine, and so they've been looking for things like, as I just said, the 5 phases, yin and yang and qi, and have described these very abstract systems on which Chinese medicine is based. And so from that, it appeared that, well, Chinese medicine is a system of correspondence. So part of it is due to how Western researchers were more interested in Chinese medicine as a, to give them a kind of description of a natural philosophy of China, of a conception of what matter is in China versus how medicine is practiced. But this is not the only reason. The other reason for this preconception of Chinese medicine as being energetic and less material than Western medicine is also, it's a discursive strategy of traditional Chinese medical doctors themselves, which came up during the Republican period of China, starting from, which was taking place between 1911 and 1949. And this was in the context of Chinese medical doctors meeting Western medical doctors and trying to defend themselves against the charge that their medical systems didn't make sense anatomically. So, but this was only applied to medical theory, so not materia medica, which is materia medica. They were accepted as well. They work. I mean, they have bioactive substances that we can research and find. I mean, nobody doubts that these are material things. So even nowadays, actually, when people think about Chinese medicine as energetic medicine, this is also because they like to emphasize that Chinese medicine is, when people talk about Chinese medicine, they mostly talk about acupuncture and meridians, and they very rarely talk about herbal medicine, which is actually the dominant form of therapy in Chinese medicine. So what I'm saying about this kind of energy medicine conception, that doesn't apply to researchers who work on materia medica. And that also, even in the Republican China period, people did not obviously think of materia medica as immaterial. But they, as I said, it was a discursive strategy because that was embraced by Chinese physicians, because the meridians, so those gateways for qi that on which acupuncture theory and other kinds of bodily interventions in Chinese medicine are based, they cannot be proven in terms of anatomical research. So they do not map onto blood vessels, and they do not map onto nerves, even though people have tried, but they failed. They just aren't the same thing. And the same thing with the triple burner. The triple burner, in this picture, you can see the body is divided into 3 parts: an upper part, a central part, and a lower part. And it's the way that what we now call metabolism is envisaged in Chinese medicine. So they are different energy systems, and they are responsible for converting food into energy, into life, into fluids, into energy. And this is in this picture, it's definitely a sort of material structure, but actually the triple burner, even within Chinese medicine, there was a debate because you just cannot find any triple burner in when you open up. Okay, so there was even within Chinese, within the history of Chinese medicine, even before the so-called meeting of Chinese and Western medicine in the 19th century, which is where scholars nowadays place the meeting, the main meeting between those two medical systems. Even before that, the triple burner was a source of debate because it was clear to some doctors that it was an immaterial thing versus other doctors, they were trying to prove that it was some sort of material structure. And then during the Republican period, some people tried to prove that this is actually a peritoneum, but of course it's not the peritoneum. Even they tried, and eventually really gave up on this, and they adopted the position that, well, our theoretical structures are immaterial, and you can't prove them by way of dissection and by way of anatomy, and that way they couldn't be attacked by those Western physicians for not making sense. But so these are two of the possible sources where this general preconception comes from. But even though this is the general preconception, so that these two medical systems are very, very different, there's also a recognition that they're actually quite similar. So any kind of practitioner will readily acknowledge that there is a sort of what they call family resemblance between the practices of Chinese medicine and the practices of traditional Western medicine. And they will say something like, oh, it's the concern with balance or the concern with homeostasis. I don't think any of these are good terms to discuss Chinese medicine with. So, but I don't have time to go into that now. But I think I would say it's something about a same way of thinking about flow and stagnations of bodily fluids or humors as a cause of illness. So, for example, any kind of accumulation that would then turn into things like cancer, for example, or they would also cause some what we now call mental illness. But mental illness was conceived as fluids acting in some certain ways, getting stuck in the body and affecting the what we now call mind. Also bodily fluids or humors are in very comparable ways targets of therapeutic invention, and most of these therapies are actually evacuative. So like bloodletting, I mean, bloodletting is not as prominent in Chinese medicine, but it definitely is done. But so there's sweating, there is diuresis, there is purging. All of these things are go-to methods to get things out of the body, and that whatever you conceptualize these things that you need to get out, what you actually are getting out of fluids, bodily fluids. So there isn't sort of, even though there are different theories, people, a Chinese medical practitioner can understand what a Unani practitioner, which is a practitioner who works sort of in the tradition of Galenic medicine, a sort of an evolvement of that, they can understand what they're doing. It's very comparable. And then there's and why is that? Is that just because, well, the body is just there are just so many ways of thinking about the body, because after all, bodies are bodies, or is there some other reason to this similarity? And so for my research, the one research on phlegm, I wanted to, when I started to do this research, actually sort of just want to look at bodily fluids, because nobody has really done that. As I just said, people like to look at the big theoretical structures like qi, yin yang, 5 phases, all of these very theoretical concepts. but they have really not looked very much at fluids, and they haven't really looked at how fluids work inside the body when you read practice books. So yes, those theoretical concepts are important, but when you read case studies, recipe literature, all these kinds of things that doctors read when they describe what they're doing, prescriptive or taking down their experience, that doesn't mention, it presupposes the knowledge of these big theoretical concepts, but it goes on and on and on about fluids, not the 5 phases, not about the system of correspondences. And so I wanted to look at this, this term tan, which means we can translate as phlegm, and it works in very similar ways as phlegm does in the Galenic tradition of medicine. And so part of my research on this project is that I was looking at the emergence of phlegm in China. So the interesting thing about phlegm is that in the very earliest classics of Chinese medicine, there was no concept of phlegm. It didn't exist. You do a keyword search, the word doesn't come up, and there isn't even anything resembling the kind of thing that what phlegm is doing now. Whereas if you look at starting from the 14th, 15th century onward, phlegm becomes very important. It becomes one of the major concepts in Chinese medicine. And actually, when you look at it, it functions in amazingly similar ways to humors in Galenic medicine. So what I've been looking at was the emergence. How did this concept emerge? How did it come into its own? And then how did it rise to prominence? So it kind of came into it emerges in 200 AD. It comes into its own in 600 AD, and then it rises to prominence between 960 and the late 13th century. And what I found was that the emergence of phlegm is connected to interchanges of Chinese and Indian medicine. So if I compare Indian medical texts and Chinese medical texts, there is I mean, you can't prove these things that happened 2,000 years ago, but I think I can plausibly argue that there was an interchange between Indic conceptions of phlegm. So Indian medicine also has phlegm as one of their major humors, not only Galenic medicine. It functions in a comparable way yet again to Galenic medicine. So this is where the concept emerges, and there are definite connections with India. And then even more interestingly, when phlegm becomes prominent, I found one text where this actually happened. So there's very little written on phlegm before this one text, and then this one text has a whole chapter on phlegm, which it's 20 times as long as anything that I've seen before that, and also has a lot of new concepts, and it reads very much like a Galenic text on phlegm theory. So this is what my argument is based on, that, okay, there actually was an exchange, not only between Indian and Chinese medicine, but also between Eurasian, it came by. So what I'm trying to argue is there was an exchange between Galenic medicine and Chinese medicine via Mongolian contacts in the Yuan period. And so quick summary of what the text is. So this is the author of the text, the dates, it coincides perfectly with the Yuan dynasty, which is the time when we know, historically proven, we know that Mongols were did bring in Islamic doctors who were practicing Galenic medicine. So we know Galenic medicine was practiced in China from historical records, and they also they instituted hospitals for the poor, and so there must have been opportunities for Chinese physicians to observe Galenic or Islamic medical practice. So this is what it is, and this text has this phlegm chapter that I was just talking about, a very extensive chapter that has all this information on phlegm that looks very much like Galenic medicine. So what it does, it pushes a specific purgative, which it recommends as a panacea to cure all kinds of illnesses, and it argues that all sickness is caused by phlegm, which wasn't really the case before. Nobody said that all kinds of sickness is caused by phlegm. in Chinese medicine. That's a new kind of move. And it also argues that all phlegm must be eliminated by purging. So these two things alone, they very much, for those of you who research Galenic medicine, well, all kinds of sickness is caused by humors, and they all must be cured by purging. So this, of course, I mean, I can't prove it to you now in 2 minutes why these similarities are there, but they are there. You just need to trust me that I've seen this. And so what the argument that the scholar is making is that all phlegm is the same, it only takes different shapes. And there he comes. He says there's white phlegm, and white phlegm changes into yellow phlegm, and yellow phlegm changes into black phlegm, or dark, actually it's not dark phlegm, it's black phlegm, according to time. And this is something that nobody said before that time. And what he's saying is that the white phlegm, it's still very, it's fluid. And then when it gets older, it condenses into yellow phlegm. And then as it gets even older, it condenses into a dark black mass that gets stuck in the middle of the body at the point of the diaphragm. And then because of that, he is able to argue that even though you don't see phlegm externally because it's stuck inside the body, it causes manifold symptoms that had previously not been associated with phlegm. So his move of saying all sickness is caused by phlegm, he can do that because he says, oh, phlegm is very concentrated, very deeply lodged inside the body, but it is causing all these manifold symptoms that you didn't know were associated with phlegm before. And including that are strange, so-called strange symptoms, which again, we would now call mental illness. So not recognizing people, not being able to speak, or speaking nonsense, climbing up walls, jumping fences. These are the kind of tropes that they give for these things. All of this, he says, is caused by phlegm. The other notable thing is that phlegm is associated for the first time in this text with corruption. Again and again, the author stresses phlegm is corrupt, and it is caused by corrupted blood. So this is where phlegm comes from, and this is and it can only, because it's stuck so deeply inside the body, it can only get out by purging. And so, of course, there are continuities with what Wang Wei is saying with earlier texts. I'm not saying like everything is completely new, but basically, so the corruption was there, and but it was all there, but it wasn't important. It's just that, of course, Chinese doctors knew that sometimes things would fester and corrupt, but it wasn't something, corruption wasn't the cause of all sickness, and it wasn't the #1 thing that people needed to worry about. And this is what it becomes in Wang Wei. Before that, yes, it was there, but it just wasn't like this one main thing, the cause of all disease. And so when you read this text, what struck me most is this blood corruption connection, which is very, very prominent in Galenic medicine. And secondly, there is this fear of corruption, which is also a prominent leitmotif of Galenic medicine. So there's this fear of humors not being evacuated from the body, but staying inside, and then they will corrupt and fester and thereby cause sickness. And that kind of fear of corruption, again, as I said, earlier Chinese doctors, they knew that such a thing as corruption existed, but they did not think that, oh, if we don't get phlegm out of the body, then it will definitely corrupt. But this is what Wang Wei is saying. We need to get phlegm out because it corrupts. And the most interesting thing of his text is that he pays such close attention to how phlegm looks like in bodily outflows, specifically in excrements. So he has page after page after page after page where he describes how phlegm looks like in feces, and usually it's feces, but sometimes it's also vomit or sputum. And this is also something that we know not only from uroscopy. So you know these urine wheels where people analyze the colors and the consistency of urine, and thereby diagnose illness, and specifically what kind of humors cause these illnesses in Galenic medicine. But we we also, this goes back to Hippocrates and then was taken up by Galen. And basically there is a whole system of looking at bodily outflows, such as any kind of bodily outflows like blood, feces, urine, sputum, tears, and so on and so forth, sweat, to see what kind of humors are in those fluids, and thereby then say what kind of illness the patient would have. And they can thereby make a prediction to how this disease would go and what will happen. But this presupposes a very specific theoretical system that would then allow you to make that prediction. And China did not have that. So what I just started wondering, what did Wang Gui do when he was describing these excrements and these colors, the colors of phlegm in excrement? So basically, there are two texts that we know of that were translated from Islamic medicine into Chinese, Galenic medicine. We know of only two texts. That doesn't mean much because a lot of it was lost. And yeah, a lot of it wasn't transmitted. And even from those texts, only parts have survived. So, but from what we can see, we cannot find that any of these kind of theories of prognosis, of looking at excrements, was ever transmitted into China. But so what I'm saying is, well, I don't think that this means it hasn't been transmitted, because only two texts, first of all, only two texts survive. Many more must have existed. And secondly, this is so this is what the texts are. And yeah, it doesn't prove anything that we can't find these theories in the text. And secondly, those kind of practices, such as diagnosing, looking at the colors and identifying colors of phlegm in excrements, would most likely be practical knowledge transmission. So they would not need a textual transmission. So what we've been looking at, and what we've in history, we keep looking for texts to prove that something was transmitted or was not transmitted. But that also doesn't prove that much, because a lot of these things in something like medicine would be transmitted orally and by practical knowledge transmission. And this is also the text that I'm reading. It reads Galenic, but at the same time, it is completely Chinese. So the text itself, there's nothing, I've looked very hard for any clue where I could find something that has been translated from some Galenic treatise into Chinese. There's nothing there. It really is a Chinese text. So, but what the author is doing, he's talking about Galenic concepts with the vocabulary of Chinese medicine. This is what I think is happening. And so basically, it's my very, very short, because I don't have much time. What I did and how I'm trying to prove this to you is that I looked at the upper text, is this phlegm treatise that I'm talking about, my text, which I think is a Galenic text, and the lower text, Islamic recipes. It's one of the texts that we know has been transmitted from Islamic medicine. It's a Galenic text that has been translated into Chinese. We know that for sure because of the grammar, because of the way it's a translation. And so what I've been seeing, I've looked at the terminology for phlegm in both texts and compared them, and found that they're very, very similar in both texts. And the only differences is that in my text, the Wang Gui text, he says corrupt blood produces black phlegm. And in the translation from Galenic medicine, it uses the term black blood. Otherwise, the terminology is the same. And so basically, and nobody has said that before me, I think that we haven't realized that white phlegm, yellow phlegm, and black blood actually are, first of all, in the translation of the Galenic text into Chinese, are actually terminology for phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So they have translated those terms into China. They were there. Secondly, an indigenous Chinese text, my text that was written by Wang Gui, he has the same terminology and he uses it. So basically the conclusion of that is, well, actually, Wang Gui, when he talks about white phlegm, yellow phlegm, and dark phlegm, he actually talks about phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And nobody has seen that because actually his text is so, it looks so very much Chinese that it's just, you wouldn't even, I mean, it took me about 10 years to actually come up with this idea that, oh, no, he is talking about the humors, not about phlegm only. And this is quite interesting as it explains why phlegm is functioning in such similar ways in both traditions that that are so striking, but as yet unexplained. So two key findings that I would like to share with you that I made. One of them is the phlegm-blocked orifices. So phlegm-blocked orifices, it's not phlegm. I mean, it's not actual orifices in the heart, but this is how people talked about madness starting from the 14th century. This is the main way that madness in China is explained from the 14th century onward. Its phlegm gets stuck in the heart orifices, and because it blocks the heart orifices, it prevents the spirit from going in and out, and thereby cognition breaks down because the spirit either is trapped inside the heart or it's trapped outside the body and can't get back in. So this communication breaks down. And so it explains, even in nowadays Chinese medicine, it explains things like stroke, postpartum madness, any kind of strange breakdown of interaction, loss of speech, for example, that sort of thing. And so this is the main explanation of madness that comes up from the 14th century onward. And I have seen it, I have found that Wang Gui, my author, is the first who uses phlegm in that sense. It was used before with putrid blood, but he is the first who uses the same explanation. He basically is the first who says that blood, that phlegm does that sort of thing, that phlegm causes madness by blocking the heart orifices. And interestingly, so Galen, he talks, Galen and the Galenic tradition after Galen, they talk about madness in very, very similar ways. So basically there is this melancholia, like you know from the history of madness, it's a black bile madness. And when you look at the explanations, it's basically black bile, or in some instances, also putrid blood that gets stuck in that area of the diaphragm and causes madness. So if you read those two things, this kind of blockage in the middle of the body causes madness in extremely similar ways in both traditions. And the first guy who uses that in China is the guy whose text I believe is influenced by Galen. So this is the one finding that I think is very interesting. So this is the black bile, and for my guy it would be black phlegm. Would then, as I just argued, he would also be talking about black bile, because black phlegm would be a translation of black bile. So this is and in both traditions, then also the treatment for madness would be purging. Again, you need to get that blockage up in the middle of the body out to reestablish communication. But I'm not saying that my guy Wang Gui copied Galen. He did not. He used a pre-existing Chinese concept of heart orifices and blocked heart orifices, but connected it with phlegm. So he somehow, it still reads very much Chinese, but it also reads very much like an explanation of black bile madness. And the other finding is that I was very happy to make is actually Wang Gui's own words. So what when I talked in the beginning of the lecture, I talked about attributive conception of matter. So qi would be the underlying ground of any bodily substance. So one way of getting rid of phlegm in early medicine would be to retransform it into another kind of body fluid. And that would not be problematic. So early Chinese medical doctors, and later ones as well, because earlier things never go away, they stay that way. But in earlier texts, phlegm is not a problem of corruption. It's not a problem of anything festering or putrefying inside the body. It's just something getting physically stuck. and then you do something, you retransform it into another modality of matter, and then you kind of take care of the blockage and you're fine. Not so with Wang Gui. Wang Gui says phlegm is dangerous because it's corrupt. And when it's corrupted, it's like, the word corrupted in Chinese is actually also defeated, gone. Like when it's corrupted, it's gone. You need to take it, you need to get it out. You can't save it. So I thought, okay, maybe when he's looking at all these excrements, because he doesn't have the whole Galenic theory of concoction and the whole explanations of humors and how they cause illness of the body, he could not have had that. I looked very hard and I just cannot find any of these difficult theories translated into Chinese medicine. But what I think he got somehow was this fear of corruption and a different conception of matter. So rather than retransforming it into another state of matter, he says it's gone. And this is, of course, like if you think of the Aristotelian conception of matter, it's I'm copying this from it's just a talk that was given yesterday, and I think this is such a great way of putting it. Life is the capacity to resist decay, but basically, basically in Aristotelian philosophy, anything that is not alive must necessarily corrupt. So why are the humors so dangerous when they stay inside the body? Because if they're not assimilated by the body, then they're that matter inside the body and they corrupt it, and so that's why they are so dangerous. Whereas in the Chinese thinking about qi and blockages, that sort of fear of, well, something that is not alive necessarily decaying, it just isn't there. So I was thinking this is really probably something that could explain why Wang Gui gets so worried about phlegm. And then I found this sentence, which I think is, so he uses ancient Chinese philosophy, Master Zhuang, that's actually the Zhuangzi, so it's a very early philosophical text. And in that text, Zhuangzi, there's this line, isn't it difficult to return that which has already taken material form to its original formless state? This is Zhuangzi, philosophical discussion that has nothing to do with phlegm. But my guy, Wang Gui, uses it and he adds, since phlegm is formed from corrupted gin fluids, some other kind of bodily fluids, it cannot be returned to the state of uncorrupted gin fluids. So basically he restates for me my hypothesis that he doesn't think that phlegm could be retransformed into another kind of bodily fluids, but it's like, it's gone. It needs to be gotten rid of. So he actually says that himself. So those are two of the things that I was very happy to find. One, of course, also has a legacy, but I don't have time to go into that. Basically, I can show that a lot of things in talking about phlegm really drastically changed after he had published his text. So people quote him, and the way that phlegm is now talked about, it's very influenced by Wang Gui. One of the legacies I would like to share with you. So this is actually a translation by from Matteo Ricci or Matteo Ricci's translation team. He's one of the earliest, if not the earliest missionary to China who translates. I think he's the first person to translate the four elements and the four bodily humors into Chinese. And the terminology, so that's the text, so 1614. And the terminology he uses for translating phlegm, bile, black bile, and blood into Chinese is the terminology that Wang Gui uses. So basically, he uses the term white phlegm, yellow phlegm, and black phlegm for translating the four humors. So later on, they say white fluid, yellow fluid, and black fluid. But the earliest text that translates Galenic humors into Chinese uses the same terminology as Wang Gui. And then if you bear this in mind, so basically from that, I would like to suggest that phlegm, the way we use it now, it doesn't only refer to phlegm as in phlegm, but it really refers to humors as in phlegm, bile, and black bile. So if we talk about phlegm is doing this and this and this in Chinese medicine, it's not quite correct, because this phlegm in Chinese medicine actually encompasses the other pathogenic humors, bile, black bile, and phlegm. And so there is a saying in Chinese medicine, which is still very prevalent, which is all illness comes from phlegm, or all illness originates from phlegm. And I shouldn't say phlegm, tan. And if I don't translate it this way, which is how people translate it all the time, but translate it with my suggestion, it reads like that: all illness comes from humors. And this is basically what you find in Galenic medicine: all illness comes from humors. So when you change the translation of phlegm and translate it and change it to the translation of humors, the kind of disconnect it's gone. They're talking about the same thing. So from those findings, then my argument is that, firstly, Chinese medicine did not develop in isolation, which is, well, it's when I talked about the presumption at the very beginning. This, of course, is also based on the assumption, well, it's two rivers that have yet to converge, but they have not been entangled for most of the history of medicine. But I don't think it's correct. I think that, secondly, humoral theories, people say, well, Chinese medicine is a energy medicine or an attributive medicine, whereas Galenic medicine and Western medicine is a medicine based on humoral theories, based on substantive theories of matters. It's also not correct. Well, it's also not incorrect. It is, but there was an adoption of humoral theories into China as well. And that didn't happen in the 19th century, as we nowadays, we place the meeting of Chinese and Western medicine in the 19th century. It happened at least in the Yuan dynasty. And if not earlier, but I can say that I find some small suggestions earlier than my text, but my text is really the one, it just happens to be there, this chapter, and I know it can be dated, and I can show that from that text onward, things change in Chinese medicine. So what does this suggest for rethinking the history of medicine? Well, of course, global history, right? Connected histories. So we just need to rethink the way we have been thinking about Chinese medicine and Western medicine from a very long time. And secondly, I'm finding it very interesting that even that my colleagues, they have no problem admitting that materia medica, even in an earlier period, so from the 9th century onward, or even 6th century onward, people say, oh, there were a lot of West Asian and Arabic materia medica in China, and it was an extremely cosmopolitan system, as in there was trade. People were using foreign materia medica in Chinese medicine, and this can be shown in medical texts. So people will acknowledge that, and I mean, you can't deny it. You just read the recipe books; it's there. There was trade going on from a very early time onward. People also have been studying the westward movement of Chinese medical knowledge. So, for example, very early anatomical illustrations of the body, how they went to the West, and they were very interested in showing that. So they're also fine with that. They're also fine with studying hybrid medical cultures at the so-called empire's contact zones. But at the same time, they maintain that Chinese medical theories were independent, incommensurate, in essentially Chinese. So not humoral, and not being able to understand, you know what I mean? Sorry. So isn't it even, I mean, it's very strange that people would maintain such a thing, given if everything else intermingles and changes, then why not medical theories? So that's the one thing that I think we need to rethink. And the other question that I would really like to spend some time thinking about is, why is it that humors or body fluids specifically functions as these vehicles of knowledge transfer? And of course, when I say these kind of things, that well, the humors, they they were transmitted to China in the 13th century, 14th century. And there was a connection. Then people say, but what about the qi? And what about yin yang? And what about the 5 phases? But that's not, it's not an either or. It's not because people adopted some concepts, some humoral concepts, that they would ditch their main theoretical concepts. Even those main theoretical concepts are probably a lot harder to change than those kind of malleable things like bodily fluids, which aren't that, which people don't take so much care in defining. So that, I think that that's one of the reasons that humors of bodily fluids may, and this is actually not only true for Chinese medicine, this is just what I happen to have discovered, but people have been talking about the transfer of knowledge between India and Islamic medicine. And it's always the humors that it's very, very complicated, because the history, it's so, they go back and forth, and you can't even, at the end, you can't even say, even when I talk about Islamic medicine coming to China, it's not actually Galenic. It's Galenic medicine that has already incorporated a lot from Ayurvedic medicine from India. And so, but it's always these humors that are doing that. And I find that quite interesting. I don't have a good answer for that now, but of course, then also, why do people not talk about this, or why did people not see that? It's because people have not been looking at bodily fluids at all. Because as I said in the beginning, they have been studying the big concepts of Chinese medicine as in natural history, but not as in medical practice. So once we start looking at medical practice texts, we will see those similarities much more clearly. And this is, of course, what practitioners have been seeing all along, but they're not interested in making that kind of argument. But in a way, I don't think, I mean, this text has been there. This is not it's not a famous text. It's not something that's been in, that people would really know about, but it's also not a text that is not, that people know it's there, and they kind of know it's important for phlegm theory. But people haven't written a history about phlegm. People have not been interested in these bodily fluids. And so once, it's just something that, I mean, we don't need to ask why, but it's just that now that once we start looking at those fluids, there will probably be more interesting things will come out. And also then the other thing, of course, also because all of these texts they're syncretic, so they're written, they look Chinese at first sight. So it's very hard to discern what could not be Chinese about them, unless one has quite a solid grasp of what the Galenic texts look like. And even then it's very hard. So where's the methodology of doing that kind of work? I think this is all I have today. Thank you very much. That's enough, right?
That was awesome. And Thor was very excited as well with the storm. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? I do have a question I can ask whilst you're thinking. Yes, Maureen, and then I'll ask my question.
So when you make the distinctions between the substantive and the attributive conceptions of these things, is it possible that your author, your discovery, when he's talking about this transition from white to yellow to black, that ultimately become phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, that this is an attributive conception, that the white can become yellow, and it's only when it becomes black that it's stuck? I mean, maybe there, you know, I don't know if there are instances where the black can go back to yellow and where the yellow can become white, but maybe it's a little bit attributive, you know, or it's not quite as fixed as a for humors kind of sense.
Except for if you start looking at the four humors, then so they're not as fixed as Galen would like them to have. So when you look at how doctors talk about them, basically black phlegm is yellow bile that has gotten burned, and white phlegm can turn into yellow bile. Things actually turn into each other. So this is why, I mean, this is very broad sketches. I don't think this means that the Galenic conception of matter is not substantive, but the humors in the philosophical system, they're fixed, but not so in when they start talking about medical profession. This is basically when Galen wants to be a philosopher, so he's read Aristotle. He wants to make medicine philosophy, and so that's why he presents that system. But it doesn't match onto what Hippocrates has said, and it doesn't match onto a lot of practice that still keeps going. Which is, I mean, this whole thing about the humors as constitutive parts of the body, it does not make sense in practice because they're poisons. Poisons do not constitute the body. This is why I'm so against this balancing. Because nobody balances the humors. Nobody says, oh, there is a little bit, not enough black bile poison in your body, so let's add a little bit black bile. No, that's the philosophical way of thinking about it, but that's not how a doctor will balance the humor.
Thanks. I'll just quickly ask my question so I don't forget it. So I'm really fascinated by the fact that there's that crossover with the mental health stuff, and madness and the explanation for madness. And I didn't know that about the history of Chinese medicine. My question would be, so if you look at the history of Western psychiatry, you're really looking at, the humoral heroic period, which then becomes the moral period. It turns into morality and then psychoanalysis and stuff after that. But as I understand it, Chinese conceptions of mental health today are still more physical. Obviously, we've become physical in the Western tradition, but that's only post 1950, really. Yeah, could you tell me, does that sort of unbroken in that way, or do you know? Like, because this is a physical conception, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, of course, people are very, as we know, they're very much influenced by Western medicine, and they will use therapy and like everybody else and talk about the mind and all these things. But these concepts, all of these words, they were translated, and most of them from Japanese actually. So they went from European languages to Japan, and then from Japan to China. But people still don't quite use them that much. So people will still refer to bodily explanations for those kind of things. Yeah.
They're like neurasthenia, right? It's still in China. Nowhere else. Okay. Yeah.
But historically, it's those kind of case studies where, like, we can see that in the Ming period, it was a period a lot of for example, you have these case studies of a woman, the first wife, getting very upset because her husband takes a second wife, and so she's extremely upset, and she develops this fire. I didn't talk about fire, but fire is very related to phlegm, and so basically she has this bodily fire, and then that causes all these things to her body, but then she will see a doctor, and the doctor won't say, like, oh, get out of this that situation, but will prescribe something to calm down the fire. That's the sort of thing we see in the sources, that things will be addressed via physical ways.
Thanks, Natalie. Really, really interesting talk. I maybe missed this point in the talk, but I was just curious. So on the one hand, you're saying, yes, there's a sort of cross-pollination, and and that's all very well and good. And you can have sort of this sort of historical evidence for this cross-pollination of concepts. But then it's another thing to sort of argue, this Galenic concept gets transmitted into Chinese medicine, but then it suddenly becomes like a central part of Chinese medicine. And that extra bit, I'm wondering if you could say more on like how and why does it not only become incorporated, but then become so central?
I mean, that's like that's the $1 million question, right? That basically there is during that period there is the rise of fire in Chinese medicine, and if you have too much fire, then you get that fire dries up you, like, basically that causes phlegm for various reasons. So we get the rise of fire, and we get the rise of phlegm, and why they were taken up why those Chinese doctors would think they are good to think with. That's, of course, that's the question that I ultimately need to solve. And that's where you really then get into speculations. My advisor, he has worked on Japanese medicine in a much later period, and he talks about the changing understanding of qi, and that he relates that to industrialization and worries about stagnation. So also in the economy, as well as increasing density and industrialization, and also what in Japan it's called the not the industrial revolution, but the industrious revolution. So people needed to keep working, and if you stop working, then things get sluggish in your body and cause obstacles. So now the Song period, of course, was something similar was happening in China. The whole so it changed from a rural economy to a sort of much more wouldn't say industrialized, but yeah, market system. And it is possible that this played a role, but these are those kind of arguments. It's just ultimately this is what everybody wants to make, those kind of big arguments, but I haven't quite yet. I think that's where I need to go, but I'm just worried about overstepping my you know what I mean, like my competency. But ultimately, yes, there must be something within China that would explain why certain things get adopted and other things don't. It's not because or not. I mean, that's yeah. We have 2 more questions.
Yeah. Thanks. I actually have 2 questions, but you can just bail out of the first one because I mean it's very interesting. But one of the things that you've alluded to is, of course, is which sources are there on the Islamic side. So which part? Because I mean, Islamic medicine, of course, at that point is already a huge enterprise, and one would say, yeah, probably my suspicion would be somewhere on the Central Asian side because simply of geographic proximity, but whether they can say anything to that. And the other part, which I found very interesting, and that one point you made a very strong argument. We talked about not just that all illness comes from phlegm, taken care of, but you have to get rid of it. And you have to purge it completely, and that which prima facie is a very clear violation of this kind of 5 phases model that is supposed to be there. Is that staying there in Chinese medicine? This idea, it's not just illnesses comes from there, because I mean, block of qi is of course also all illness comes from the block of qi, so you have to do something. Is it really you have to get rid of it? And the other thing is, of course, the European iteration of Galenic medicine would be the fluid that mostly is taken out of the humus is, of course, blood. It's not phlegm. I mean, phlegm is also taken out, but the most widely practiced medical therapy is bloodletting at that point. So is anywhere of that coming into China at all?
So blood is basically lead because it's a carrier of bad humors. Blood is not in per se a pathogenic fluid. That's why the Galenic system of the 4 humors does not make sense, because blood is not bad. It's only corrupted blood, and corrupted blood is blood that has bile or phlegm in it that gets purged. So you don't purge blood for itself. Apart from, there is something like plethora where you have too much blood, but that's just, it's like blood that could go bad and that you get rid of. But blood itself is not, it's not a pathogen. Right, but they, but I mean, I haven't made a specific study of that because that's not my field, but I would be confident that you could find that blood is associated with humors or with putrefaction. Like something has happened to that blood, like either you've eaten too richly, like there's too much, there's like something that has happened to that blood to make it bad. Like people get really obsessed about cleansing like blood, but also of course enemas, right? Like I don't know how many times a year or almost a day you need to have enemas because you need to cleanse your digestive system, and this is the fear of corruption. and that in Islamic medicine, I mean, there are in again, I mean, I'm not an expert in in Islamic medicine, but there is enough treatises there that I can show you that have been translated from the Galenic tradition into Arabic or Persian that definitely will. I mean, the prognosticon is one of the, it's always among the centrally translated texts in all of the Galenic medicine transmissions from the very early period onwards. And it's also then among the texts who get translated back into Latin among like the core texts. So I've taken care to make sure that this is the case. And then I realized, like, what are you trying to prove? You're trying to prove that the main diagnostic of Galenic medicine was actually transmitted. Like it couldn't have been practiced without people practicing that method of looking at excrement. So it doesn't even, in a way, I tried to prove something which is sort of, it's almost like, even from the practical perspective, they couldn't have practiced Galenic medicine without looking at without doing uroscopy or coproscopy or any other forms of looking at bodily fluids, because this is how they diagnose ill patients. Like if you can't diagnose somebody, how can you practice the medicine? And then, but you asked a really interesting question about how did this evolve, the transforming phlegm back into another matter versus getting rid of it. And basically, the debate continues. So people read Wang Gui, and some of them, so there is a further evolvement in the Ming period, in that people say, oh, there is substantive fire and there is empty fire. And substantive fire, that will cause substantive phlegm. And that's like a very stubborn, hard to get rid of phlegm. And then there's empty kind of phlegm. And that is because your body is depleted. And when your body is depleted, you can't purge it, because then you will deplete it even more. And then you will have even more phlegm. So doctors who do not understand that there are two different kinds of phlegms or humors, I would argue, they are killing their patients by purging them, even though they may be purging a depleted patient, whereas you can only replete patients, but not deplete patients. And that's something that happens after Wang Gui. So basically, as I said before, earlier things rarely go away, right? So Wang Gui merely adds one thing to the repertory, and most people don't take him up on everything. They wouldn't say, well, okay, Wang Gui says we need to use purging we need to purge and we can't do anything else, but they will use it for certain kinds of phlegm. And even I've seen people who criticize Wang Gui and say, well, you can't use it for depletion of phlegm, but there is a certain kind of phlegm where it's really, really useful and should be used. And interestingly, there is this, so basically there is this connection between putrid blood and leftover food that then turns into bad humors in the body. And that I can also trace these kind of connections, and that they need to be purged. I can trace this in other scholars from that period onward. And also, interestingly, scholars also from the Yuan period that have not been associated with having any connection with Islamic medicine. I mean, these are the most important theoretical forefathers of Chinese medical theory. People, I don't know what they make of it. I've just written it in my article that I wrote, and I said, well, I can see that this guy is also pushing that, and it does sound very much like a Galenic reasoning to me. But people, I don't know, will they be shocked when I suggest that one of the main theoretical figures in Chinese medicine may have been influenced in some ways by Galenic medicine? And if they're shocked, then why? Like, what is so surprising about it, actually? Why are we still so shocked by this kind of thing, that this could happen? Isn't it kind of natural almost? You know, like I almost want to turn the question around, like why? But then there's of course a lot of other questions come into that, like nationalism and so on and so forth. Yeah.
We have one more question before we wrap up. We've started late, so we're just going a bit over time.
I thank you. This is on blood as well, but from the Chinese side, when you explained Wang Gui's 3 forms of phlegm, it covered 3 of the 4 humors, but it didn't refer to blood. Is it disregarded entirely in his text, or is it given some other status but still there?
Putrid blood. turns into black phlegm.
Okay.
So basically putrid blood turns into what in Galenic terms would be black bile. And this is actually something when you read texts in Galenic medicine, this is actually something that you find in Galenic medicine
Yeah.
as well, that black bile is sometimes talked about as a blood, putrid blood. So much so that some writers, they seem to have a hard time distinguishing between putrid blood and black bile.
Black bile. But in Wang Wei, does he take that same approach? Are there two different ways to get black bile? One is from white bile corrupting and the other from blood?
This is a really complicated question.
I'll
And
give up.
there are two so in the system of Galenic medicine, black bile can be either dry and cold or dry and hot. Most people only know of it being dry and cold because this is how it's. I can go back to the that here, dry and cold. But actually, so there is a kind of black bile that is dry and cold. And when I read the one text that we know has been translated from Islamic medicine, the way that it talks about white phlegm and black phlegm, i.e. phlegm and black bile, it talks about it as being cold humors. And it also causes very similar things as this kind of black bile would be causing in some Galenic medical texts. But then there are other Galenic medical texts where black bile is actually conceptualized as dry and hot. And this is I have it here, the melancholia intensa or melancholia adasta. This is basically when the yellow bile becomes burned and turns into hot bile. And there are articles about this. You can read about blood madness. This is definitely associated with heat. So, and this is how Wang Wei talks about black bile. For him, it's definitely something associated with fire and heat and not with cold. So there seems to be a contradiction there. But then I don't think it is, because the way, when we think about this, and there wasn't just one transmission line into China, people would have been orally talking about these things. Even the fact that, so Wang Wei talks about black phlegm, the Islamic recipe book, it talks about black blood. It's not the same terminology, but that just means that there were different transmission line and people will be using different vocabulary because they weren't relying on one master text. This is how I see it.
Thanks, Natalie. Please join me in thanking Natalie again. Now we have our Dyson lecture, which is in the Eastern Avenue lecture block, which is just a short distance from here, but we have a little bit of time to get there. The talk will start at 6. So if you want to make your way over there, if you're not sure how to get there, ask one of the people with the green dot on their thing.
Was it like general enough?
Yeah. Well, I can't tell if I do history of this.
Thanks, that was great.